Guys, welcome to our finals, part one. What we will be discussing for our part one lesson is about designing as a teaching strategy. So we have the introduction, objectives, then we'll be discussing the factors to be considered, instructional objectives, the meaning of entry behaviors, and then also the available resources. We will also be discussing creating an appropriate mix of approaches and methods, and then the summary. And after the end of the lesson, you can answer the available exercises in between these topics, and then you can check your progress or your answers in the check your progress section, no? After the lesson. Let's go with the introduction. The term strategy has originated from military science, or it is a plan deliberately prepared to fight and defeat an enemy. In the field of education, ignorance is our enemy. Hence, here a teacher has to plan more deliberately to fight this invisible enemy. Strategy is always considered as scientific in its approach. By telling this, it is implied that the teaching strategy will have a sound basis of objective. Strategy caters to all personality dimensions. Ano yung mga dimensions ng isang student? Cognitive, affective, and psychomotor, no? Later on, briefly, no, didiscusin natin kung ano yung tatlong dimension na yan. And also, what are the strategy or what are the factors, no, the three essential factors that affects the formulation of teaching strategy, no? Namely, these are the objective or the purpose, teaching learning situation, and the evaluation. Okay? So fulfilling all the above said aspects, a teacher has to understand the theoretical background of designing. No? So we will be discussing this theoretical background, no, for this entire lesson. Our objectives, after studying this unit, you should be able to explain the process of designing a teaching strategy, describe the factors, define instructional objectives, and you should be able to explain the nature of instructional objectives. You should also be able to define entry behavior and explain how to make use of the available resources. You should also be able to suggest, no, the means of creating an appropriate mix of approaches and methods. Okay, let's go now with designing a teaching strategy. You know that while teaching, a teacher will be obviously aware of the heterogeneity of his class. So meaning the diversity ng mga students mo. Kaya yun ibig sabihin ng heterogeneity. Heterogeneous ito. Which is the opposite of homogeneous. So, pag homogeneous, ibig sabihin, isang group, isang lahi, parang ganon. Pag heterogeneous, diverse yung kanyang attitude, diverse, magkakaiba, no? Different ang kanilang, meron silang individual differences. By doing this, the teacher might have classified the students as special, advanced, college preparatory, terminal, heterogeneous, or homogeneous groups. So, magkakaroon ka ng grouping sa yung students. And that is, although hindi naman yun ang first step, that is one of the determining factor, no, in designing a specific teaching strategy. Okay, by taking into account the individual differences in your class. No, that is to say, teachers plan their objectives, materials, resources, techniques, and teaching strategies to meet the needs and abilities of the majority of students. Okay, so by knowing those differences, you can appreciate, no, how to, no, meet the needs and abilities of the majority of the students within your class. In the first unit of this block, you have already introduced to certain new terms like technology of teaching. So yan, na-discuss natin yan before sa prelim at saka sa midterm. Now, yan, babalikan uli natin yan, no? Yung ibang term sa kanya like objectives of teaching or instructional objectives and also yung entry behavior. What are the factors to be considered, no, in designing or making a strategy for teaching? Teaching is a profession which involves certain skills as well as fund of knowledge. Teaching is helping pupils to learn. The professional teacher should estimate the situation and then select the most suitable strategy and tactics in accordance with this diagnosis of of what the situation calls for. This strategy refers to the overall approach ng teacher. So kung meron kang subject, for example, math, at ang topic mo ay simpleng arithmetic, no? So ano yung overall approach mo? Oh, so of course, it will depend on the number one nga, no? You identify kung ano yung differences, individual differences ng mga students. Yan. For example, kung nasa elementary ka, magtuturo ka ng basic arithmetic, then you have to take into consideration kung anong level ng knowledge nila. And that is part of the diagnosis, no, na sinasabi natin. And then, after that, you can consider the content. Maraming way ng pagtuturo ng arithmetic. So, you have to research. No? The teacher should be able to find time to select the appropriate contents, no, for the specific situation or learning environment. That is to say, in deciding what strategy to use, one crucial factor is deciding what subject matter to include. Thus, content is part of a strategy. To select a strategy means it has to be done in context with several variables. So, hindi lang yung content, hindi lang yung first diagnosis mo about their individual differences. Marami tayong variables na dapat i-consider, no? But after knowing those variables and taking them into account, you should be able to form one general pattern, no? To be adopted or a general pattern that follows these 5 steps. Number one is diagnosis, two, preparation, guiding learning, third, fourth, evaluating the results of learning, and then fifth, the follow-up. Okay? Ano yung diagnosis? It is the step in which the teacher determines what should be done. No? So, para ka merong ano yan eh, meron kang, ikaw yung doktor, meron kang pasyente, ang unang ginagawa ng doktor is make a diagnosis. So, yung parang classroom mo, yung mga students mo, parang yun yung pasyente mo. So, you make a diagnosis, and that is the first step to determine what should be done, what strategy, what approach that can best give them the a better learning experience. Second, preparation refers to the teachers getting themselves ready to teach, motivating the pupils, and planning. So, preparation is planning. Preparation is preparing yourself to teach. Okay? Hindi ka pa nagtuturo niyan. You're just preparing, no? Next is guiding learning. So, it includes the class proper, no? Meaning the presentation, the discussion, or whatever is done. So, ito na yun, nagtuturo ka na. That is called, it is included in the guiding learning step, no? You are discussing, you are presenting, okay, and you are teaching the students to learn, no? So in the next step, which is the evaluating step, the teacher attempts to assess the success of his teaching by finding out how much the pupils have learned. Ito na yung evaluation, no? Ito na yung nagbibigay ka ng quiz, nagbibigay ka ng exam, or nagpapa-oral recitation ka, no? You are evaluating na how much the pupils have learned, no, from your lesson. Next is the follow-up. It is the process of filling in the spots that students seem to have missed teaching, and if necessary, in building on what the pupils have learned. No? After evaluating, more or less, alam mo na kung sino yung mga students na nagpe-fail or slow. So, yun yung time na kailangan mo ng mag-follow up. Meaning, i-guide mo na sila. Halimbawa, mababa ang score mo sa subtraction, mababa ang score mo sa multiplication, you should improve by doing this, by doing that, and you should improve by practicing. Yan. So, magbibigay tayo sa kanila ng additional, for example, exercises or additional instruction or kaya additional guidelines para maka-catch up sila no doon sa iba na marurunong na. That is what is included in the follow-up step. The key step in all this, of course, is diagnosis. So without diagnosis kasi, hindi mo alam kung paano ka mag-prepare. Hindi mo alam kung paano ka mag-present. Hindi mo alam kung paano sila evaluate, no? So obviously, yung number one or yung first step ang pinakamahalaga sa kanila. Without diagnosis, one does not have an adequate basis on the selection of an strategy. So although nakadepende tayo sa diagnosis, still marami pa rin tayong variables na dapat na i-take into account. No? Yung tinatawag nating variables or the factors. No? So let's discuss it. Number one is the setting of objectives. No? Number one variable or factor is the objectives. It could be overall objectives that influence the type of curriculum or a specific objectives. So pag sinabing overall, medyo generalize siya. Pag sinabing specific, maybe siya yung daily, no? Objective mo for your daily lesson. Yung overall naman, maybe yung objective mo for the whole term. Next factor is the target group or the students. So yung kanilang individual differences, no? Meron kasi kanya-kanyang interest yan, abilities, may kanya-kanyang attitudes, potentials, backgrounds, yan. Yung mga experience na nila at skills, no? At yung style of learning. Okay? So whenever teacher is planning for teaching, he must use his professional knowledge for both pupils in general and pupils and individual pupils in particular. No, so the teacher should be able to affect his or her students as a whole, no, and also as an individual. Next, understanding and utilizing the knowledge of group dynamics. O, kasama yun dito, related to dito sa communicating with your students as a whole or in general or as an individual. No? So as a whole, communicating with them in general means you have to know, you have to have the knowledge of a group dynamics, no? Kung paano mo i-motivate ang isang grupo. Iba kasi ang group dynamics, individual dynamics, no? Paano mo, no, turuan or paano mo i-motivate in learning ang isang class, ang isang grupo, no? Yun yung sinasabing knowledge of group dynamics. Next, we have the nature of the subject to be taught is one more factor. No? Yung nature, yung selection ng iyong content. Another factor is the technology. The right combination of techniques, equipment, and materials for specific occasions. Yan, nakaka-apekto yan sa iyong formation ng strategy. Also, the environment that surrounds the school is yet another factor. Yan. Nagtuturo ka ba sa ilalim ng puno? Yan. Nasa loob ka ba ng classroom? Mainit ba sa classroom mo? Yung mga estudyante mo ba ay kumpleto yung mga gamit? Ayun yun, mga dapat mong i-consider, no? Yung mga student mo ba, katulad ng mga OFW, nag-aaral dito sa school, di ba? Oh. Laging puyat yan, pagod. So, ano yung learning strategy? So, you have to take them into account or consider them, no? In evaluating your strategy. The teacher himself can be considered as the last. Yan. Yung competence mo, yung ideals mo, yung also your attitude, general attitude, and your personality. It is the, sabi rito, it is the least factor. Yan, pinakahuling factor na pwedeng makaapekto sa iyong teaching strategy. Teaching strategies and tactics should be consistent with good communication techniques. Next, although teachers must adopt the proper teaching strategies for the goals at which they are aiming, yun ang sinasabi nating objective, the success of it lies with the skillful use of it. For this, the teacher must consider not only his teaching goals, but also the subject matter, pupils, and other classroom variables. No? In order to know which strategies and tactics to choose and utilize, one must diagnose the situation. Now, in general, while designing teaching strategies are teachers to give you the consideration to certain principles. So after ng variables, after ng factors, after ng five steps na diniscuss natin kanina, we will discuss now the principles that a teacher must take into account in designing the teaching strategies. Number one is the principle of selection. So what is included here is selection, the sequence, and structuring, no? Which constitute the principle of selection. Ano ibig sabihin? Yung relevant materials mo dapat ay appropriately selected. Okay? And then yung sequencing, katulad nung diniscuss natin during the midterm, no? Paano may sequence yung lesson. Siyempre, kung hindi pa marunong mga students, you have to start from the basic and then you end up last na yung mga advanced lesson, no? So, proper sequencing. And also kasama doon sa proper sequencing, syempre yung structuring ng iyong lesson plan. Next, we have the principle of maxims of teaching. The maxims of teaching like from simple, complex, easy to difficult, known to unknown, concrete to abstract. Ano yung logic ng teacher in teaching? So may mga teacher na agad mahirap, no, yung kanyang ituturo. Yan. Mas madali sa kanya magturo ng gano'n, ng mahirap. Pag madali, okay, medyo hindi siya interesado. No? So, ano yung maxim mo? You have to build your own. You have to make your maxim or your set of principles na dapat mong i-follow. Sa palagay mo, dapat mong i-follow uh, para makatulong dun sa learning experience ng iyong students. So ano yung ano mo, no? Ikaw ba ay simple to complex, easy to difficult, known to unknown, concrete to abstract, no? O katulad ng concrete to abstract, medyo katulad ng kung ang subject mo ay calculus, yan. Mga maraming abstract symbol doon, no? Physics, yan. Maraming formula. Concrete to abstract. Yung ba ang iyong, sana yung ba yung maxim mo? Okay? You want to explain the abstract by giving the students a concrete explanation. Or you want your student to know the unknown. Yan. That is called the maxim or your guiding principle in teaching. No? Next, we have the principle of variety. To avoid monotony naman to, no? To avoid boring your students. No? You have to follow the principle of variety. Teaching strategies can be used or interchanged in any order without disturbing the continuum of teaching learning process. Okay, so dapat magkaroon ka ng variety, no? So, for example, observation, first day mo, okay, observation ang gagamitin mo. The next day, collecting of materials, information, demonstration, experimentation. The next day, magbibigay ka ng educational games or gagawin mo naman the next day, dramatization. Yan. The teacher, no, chooses from these options subjectively. So, meaning personally. Choice na niya yung preference na ng teacher yan. Just to avoid the monotony, no, in teaching. Next, we have the principle of motivation, this being the basic to learning. Teachers should judiciously adapt motivating factors in teaching strategies. Yan. Ano ba yung ano mo, motivating technique mo or strategy? Ipe-praise mo ba bawat matataas na bawat students na makakakuha ng mataas na grade, no? Okay, sa elementary ginagawa yan sa prep, no? Tinatatakan dito sa kamay kapag very good. Sa graduation natin, no? Nagbibigay tayo ng ano, kaya lang long term 'yon, no? Graduation. Nagbibigay tayo ng medals, ng award, yan, certificate, no? So ano yung i-reinforce mo? I-reinforce mo ba yung failing? Meaning, i-reinforce mo na wag sila mag-fail o i-reinforce mo na mag-focus sila by being better, no? Better students or being good at the test or examination. Yung ibig sabihin ng reinforcing is, gagawin mo ba sila ng penalty kapag meron silang mali? Or bibigyan mo sila ng reward para bago yung behavior nila, gumawa sila ng mabuti, no? That is called reinforcing. Ano yung reinforce mo? Mamili ka sa dalawa. Meron namang pinaghahalo, no? Kapag maganda yung ginawa, maganda yung performance ng student, nagbibigay yung teacher ng reward, no? Ng acknowledgement. Kapag gumawa din siya ng mali, may student na gumawa ng tatamad-tamad, meron siyang punishment, meron penalty. Meron ganun, merong mixed methods, no? Nasa teacher na 'yon, no? Kung ano yung gusto mo. Kung ano yung sa tingin mo ay will positively change the behavior of the students for the better, no? Next, we have the principle of correlation with environment. Yan. Teaching learning process occurs in a emotional, biophysical, and cultural environment. Hence, it is to be in correlation with the learner's environment. Yan. You have to take into consideration the environment. Principle of feedback. Feedback is an avenue to check the quality of teaching and learning process. Yan. We have the evaluation and feedback factor. And gaano mo kadalas gagawin yung evaluation, it should be continuous, no? Sabi dito. Okay, next we have the principle of child's all-around development. Hindi lang, for example, hindi ka lang dapat nakapokus sa cognitive or affective lang or sa psychomotor ng students, no? Dapat nakapokus ka rin sa tatlo. And that is what we call the all-around development. Okay? Next, we have the principle of individual difference. Yan. In-explain na natin yan. Number 1, sa ating list, kauna natin in-explain the heterogeneity of your class. You have to take into consideration. And we go now with instructional objectives. No? Objectives, sabi natin kanina, number 1 factor or variable, yung objectives. No? Ang sinasabing objective doon ay instructional objectives. Objectives are means to achieve the broader goals and aims. Objectives tend to become more and more specific, then they will take the form of instructional objectives. Yan. Instructional objectives is a description of what a successful learner will be able to do at the end of instruction. Katulad ng objectives natin na binasa kanina, no? At the end of our lesson. Ano yung dapat na magawa ng student, no? The statement of an objective must be written is observable terms, no? Dapat daw pwede nating ma-evaluate, pwedeng masukat, no? Ma-quantify. That it can give an opportunity to test the learning of a learner, no? So yung mga behavioral, operational, and instructional objectives, yun yung nire-refer dito ng statement of an objective. Instructional objectives may be stated for desired long or short range. So, long term or long range or short range, pwede tayong gumawa ng ganong 2 types of instructional objectives. The more limited an objective, the more likely can be attained within the allotted time. No? Konti lang yung objective mo, limited in regards with time, the more it can be easily attained. Yung mga long range na instructional objectives, yan, medyo siya pang matagalan, no? Matagal bago ma-achieve. So ito yung mga criteria, no, in forming instructional objectives, no? Number 1 is usefulness. The desired learning should have value in the lives of the pupils. Yan. And mabubuo mo lang to kung kilala mo yung students mo in terms of their environment, in terms of their cognitive, affective, and psychomotor skills. No? Next, timeliness. Learning should be concerned with material familiar at the present. Yan. This is referring to the choice of your content, the selection, no? The proper selection of subject matter. Kung yung tinuturo mo ay regards sa new technology, so dapat mga bagong devices yung ituturo mo, mga bagong ideas, mga bagong technology. Yan yung sinasabing timeliness. Fitness, kung yung subject matter ba or yung objective mo ay nag-fit sa general or overall long-range objective ng iyong lesson, no? Next, we have the appropriateness. The learning experience provided to students must be appropriate for the maturity and backgrounds of the pupils concerned. Practicability, learning experiences that are needed for development of a learning must be practically be possible. So yung objectives na gagawin mo dapat achievable, no? Practical siya, no? And also it can be applied ng mga students, no? In relation to dito sa useful. And also I think sa appropriateness. If the instructional objectives are stated with all clarity, then it helps the teaching process to run in a smooth way. Okay? So yung nung midterm, diniscuss natin, di ba, how to design a lesson plan and also a unit plan. Na-discuss natin doon yung kung paano gumawa ng objectives. Nagamit natin yung mga specific terms. For example, to be able to evaluate, to be able to apply, to be able to define, to be able to enumerate, to be able to analyze, yun yung mga ganong objectives. So ito yung sinasabi dito. No? It specifies very precisely the goal, no? With all clarity. Objectives are valid criteria for evaluating students' achievement. Yung objectives na ginawa mo, ibig sabihin, pwede rin natin gamitin sa pag-evaluate at the end ng lesson. No? Next, these are the very good means for getting feedback. Okay? If the objectives can be used, no, for evaluating the students, then they can be used also for getting a proper feedback. Okay, let us go through some of the examples for instruction objectives. So, ito na yun, no? So, pupil will be able to, example lang to, no? Define, notice yung mga ating verb, no? To be able to define, explain, to reason out, be able to write, to be able to write a label diagram, to be able to set up. Yan. Di ba achievable siya? uh, all of these objective statements conform, no, dun sa atin din sa taas, no, dito sa usefulness, timeliness, fitness, appropriateness, and practicability. The above examples, you may notice that the instructional objectives have been spread over to cognitive, affective, psychomotor domains. So ito yon, no? So in forming the instructional objectives, you have to take into consideration how to or yung question, no, you have to ask yourself, no, is the objective I created or I designed or I formed can, no, develop their cognitive. Pag sinabi cognitive, your mental skill nila. So mental development. Or is the objective I created can develop their emotion or their affective domains or their psychomotor domains, which is their physical skills or the tinatawag nating hand-eye coordination. No? So, yun yung tatlong domains na dapat may consider. No? Under ng cognitive, meron tayong may specific term na pwede mong gamitin at the start of your objective. For example, to be able to know. Yan, knowledge yan. No? That means, kapag nabasa mo yung objective na merong word na nagsisimula sa knowledge or know, to know, ibig sabihin nun, ang gusto niyang i-develop dun sa student or gustong i-develop ng lesson is yung mental skill ng bata, no, ng students. So, kung may makita kang analysis, no, to be able to analyze, to be able to comprehend, to be able to synthesize, and to be able to apply and evaluate. Yan, cognitive lahat yan. Kung sa emotion naman, sa affective domain, to be able to receive, organize, to be able to respond, to be able to characterize and value, no? Then you can be sure na it is for the development of the emotion or the affective domain. Sa psychomotor naman, there is no standardized classification, no? We can only use the word application, understanding also. And very general kasi siya, depende sa kasunod na mga wordings, no? After ng, for example, knowledge or understand. To be able to know, yan, halimbawa, to be able to know how to draw face. Okay, kung nagtuturo ka ng drawing, no? That is psychomotor. Okay? So, kaya ang sabi rito, for the psychomotor domain, there's no standardized classification. Next, we have the entry behavior. Instructional objectives, as it has been explained, help a teacher in teaching immensely. They give a general guide. Entry behavior, yung sinasabi nating part siya ng diagnosis na para ma-form mo yung iyong instructional objective, you have to know your students or you have to know your class, no? Kung ano ba yung kanyang previous experience, kung ano yung previous knowledge niya. So from there, you will base all your decisions, no? Sa entry behavior. Yan yung sinasabi natin, yan yung dahilan, no, kung bakit papa-entrance exam ang ibang school, no? Because they are trying to know the entry behavior of the students. Para at the end of the term, no, ay malaman nila yung progress. Kasi i-compare nila yung entry behavior ng student sa present behavior niya, no? So yung behavior, entry behavior is yung behavior ng students nang pumasok siya ng school o nang pumasok siya sa isang class, at yung kanyang current behavior ay yung ending behavior niya, okay, is yung result, no, after na matapos niyang isang course, no. So by comparing those two behavior, then we can know, no, the progress the students had acquired, no, while taking the course or the lesson. So as you know it already, the teaching process is to be carefully planned for the purpose of attaining predetermined objectives, no? So we use the task analysis, no? Ano daw yung task analysis? The process of breaking tasks down into their simpler components. Number one, we have identifying the entry behavior of the learners. Two, identifying learning experiences. Identifying appropriate method strategies for providing learning experiences. So ito yung mga tasks na dapat gawin ng teacher in before forming the teaching strategy. So entry behavior, kilalanin yung learner. Learning experience, you identify mo na kung ano yung past experiences or past knowledge ng students. And then after that, determine the appropriate method strategies, no? And also the appropriate teaching learning situation na ibibigay mo dun sa student. So by knowing the entry behavior, you will the teacher has the ability, no, to know the potential abilities and also the previous knowledge of the students. Okay, available resources, yeah, whatever may be the strategies and tactics that are planned. One thing is evident that teachers must use their strategies and tactics partially on the basis of the tools and materials available to them. Yeah. So, an example natin, meron tayo mga books, encyclopedia, newspapers, periodicals, laboratory equipments, and other infrastructures. Now, apart from this, the teacher has to be sensitive enough to locate and identify some of the easily available materials that can be turned out as resources. So, a teacher should be very resourceful, no, in finding those available resources, no, para sa appropriate learning experience na ibibigay natin sa students. As far as possible, the daily experiences, common materials must come in priority as teaching resources. So if you know, no, yung entry behavior ng students, if you know your students well, if you know your class, their individual differences, then you can clearly select, no, or appropriately select the available resources that are needed in giving your students a better learning experience. So we have also a good library and well-equipped laboratory as the two essential resources, no, for teaching. Yan. Kaya yung ibang teacher, lagi nilang sinasuggest at the end of the lesson, no? You can research in your library, no? Okay? Pero ngayon, personally ako, hindi ko na sila nire-refer sa library. Kay Google na lang, nire-refer ko sila. You can research in Google. Yan, for additional learning materials. Yan. Kung gusto niyo, for example, gusto niyo maalaman pa yung further explanation, yan, you can go to YouTube, you can go to Google. Yan. Hindi na library ngayon, though may library pa rin ngayon, but hindi naman siya in our environment, in our situation, hindi siya accessible, no? Hindi siya appropriate para sa atin. Also, radio programs, TV programs, certain educational channels which are exclusively meant for imparting education information is yet another resource. Yan. Maraming resources na pwede nating i-refer, pwede nating kunin at ibigay sa ating mga student. Also, community resources, yan. In this way, the botanical gardens, plant nurseries, garden factories, post office, bank. Kaya pag minsan, ang isang school o ang isang class, may tinatawag tayong excursion, di ba? Yan. It is a one way of giving the students a different learning experience, no? Yung ganyan. Pupunta tayo, for example, sa botanical garden para makita yung different types ng plants. O kaya pag animals naman, punta tayo sa zoo. Okay? Kung ikaw naman ay nasa isang financial course, pwede kang pumunta sa bangko, no? Dalhin mo yung mga students mo sa isang bank environment, no? Para magkaroon sila ng overview, no? Of how to work in that specific environment. Next, we have the creating an appropriate mix of approaches and methods. In the end, after designing your teaching strategy, you can then select the mix or specific approaches and methods, no, to apply in your teaching. So in the previous units of this blocks, you came to know about different teaching strategies, approaches, and methods. So meron tayong teacher-centered, learner-centered, activity-centered, subject-centered. Meron din tayong conceptual approach, investigatory approach, inductive and deductive. Subjectively, ikaw na yung pipili, na yung teacher na pipili kung anong approach. Pag minsan, minimix nila. Yan. Meron teacher na teacher-centered as well as learner-centered din. Yan. Minimix nila yung approach appropriately, no, sa environment and then sa type of students na kanilang tinuturuan. Bakit natin minimix yung approach? Bakit natin binabago? Dahil ito yung reason, no? So that not only the cognitive development, not only the affective or the psychomotor development is enhanced. Yan. Para lahat ma-enhance, no? Yun yung sinasabi nating all-around development ng students. This general guideline, they give a general guideline for the class of transaction as well as throw light on the subject matter. This is the general way of presenting the subject matter. Okay? Can have an interwoven network of different approaches. So, ayan, no? Take note. Ang isang subject matter, for example, math, pwede mo siyang ituro in different or interwoven approaches, okay, or method. Okay, so that is all for our finals lesson part 1.